We'll have to read it anyway. So, but he imagines the father accused of a commercial crime, and it's just a few lines, and it leaves you at the edge of a cliff, really, in which he's, sentenced to hard labor in a uranium mine and hangs himself with a belt. I mean, what were you? How did it feel to you as the author to sort of leave us there?
Well, the idea is that since we're so close with Alec's perspective, the reader would know only as much as Alec would know. That's all he knows. Therefore, if that's his experience, then that becomes the reader's experience as well. And I also understand that this is an act of artifice. I'm constructing it. So what's the least possible amount of information that I can offer to the reader to allow the reader to understand what's going on?
Hockey, a similar climate, a strong dollar, which I was trying to remember if that was the case.
The dollar was quite strong back then. I'm not sure if it was as strong as it is now.
Yeah, and a place that has that economic success, quote, without victimizing Negroes or Latin American peasants, becomes the reason for their choosing Canada to the extent that they have a choice. There is something here which is called, in Canadian literary circles, the myth of rescue, that some people are objecting to. This idea that in many Canadian novels, readers, we're told, are sort of looking for something to confirm the idea that Canadians are doing a good thing by accepting refugees, and enormously pleased by novels that somehow demonstrate the possibility of gratitude of some kind. For being able to come. I'm not saying explicitly, but there are novelists like Dion Brand or Rawi Haj who very much resent this paradigm. And you were not writing an immigrant novel of that sort, but to what extent was Canada, as it was imagined, did it work out to be the right place? I mean, I suppose we learn more in Natasha than in this book.
Yeah, you would learn more in Natasha, but for the family at this moment, it's what do they know about Canada? What do they know about any of these places? But from my family's perspective and speaking to other people, the exposure to Canada was the Olympics in 1976, the 72 Super Series, which was big, and just this perception that Canada was a kindler, gentler America. It was not a superpower. The climate was similar. There's a line there, as they're trying to debate where they go, and Alex says, as another reason to go, well, it's more European than America and more American than Europe, which frankly is true, and it's also, in my opinion, I think, Canada's attraction and its shortcoming.
And Royman at one point thinks, and rather comically tries to make it, imagines he can make his case to Trudeau directly. How much was Trudeau a figure in the immigrant imagination?
I mean, that's hard for me to say. That part is, part of the fiction. I'm sure Trudeau was probably the most recognized Canadian prime minister ever, including for Soviet people. I mean, he was quite well known.
Okay. I do want to leave time for a few questions before you sign, David, because I'm sure you will be signing. So perhaps I should open it up to the floor. And there's a microphone in the center. And as you've been doing so, tell me if you don't hear anything, and I'll repeat the question. Are there any questions for David? When I did my own book tour, I would give out free T-shirts to the first person brave enough to answer a question. But you all seem like a very sophisticated crowd. There we go.
You gotta go the long way.
Actually, David will like this. He does like athletes. They figure big in his...
I do.
Good evening. My name is Detlef Karthaus, and I'd like to know how you first became aware of Esperanto, and whether the part in the book where they're publishing books in Esperanto, whether that was part of your family's experience. Thank you.
So thank you, Detlef. And Detlef, I should say, actually, is part of the Toronto Esperanto community and helped me. I've never met him before. I didn't really know he was so spry, for instance. So the idea of Esperanto, it does play a role in the book because of these interwar social and political movements, so of the 1930s, these utopian movements. And in talking about Samuel, who goes through this experience, these were the revolutionary movements that were supposed to provide a salvation to people. Esperanto was one of them. I actually became really intrigued and kind of seduced by Esperanto, which is not proven at all by my inability to learn the language or really apply myself very well, which I'd like to do. But I found that fascinating, and it seemed to make sense to me that this would play a role in Samuel's history, and it ends up playing a role narratively in the book. Esperanto kind of comes back in this peculiar way. I'll just give a very short anecdote. When I went with my girlfriend to Rome to research for 4 months, and we went and we were there during Easter, and the Pope, who was then Pope John Paul II, came out and gave a benediction in every language, including Esperanto. And there was a group of people who attended, and I think they were probably the most enthusiastic and boisterous were the Esperantists, who they lifted placards, with the proper word written in Esperanto. I'm going to do more with Esperanto, I think. I find it really fascinating. Anyway, thank you.
Sir?
David, since Natasha and Other Stories was, in a way, a novel, but really you've been known as a short story writer, at least to begin with. What was the thing about writing a novel that surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most? I found it, I've written stories, I directed a film. I found it the most difficult thing I've ever done. I think it's the most demanding, endeavor creatively. Because of, and also I think some of it has to do with the nature of this novel, but I think that's probably always true. How much of yourself you have to pour into it to do it correctly, how large a project it is, how complex, particularly if you set out to do something that you feel is substantial, how complex it is to carry that out for 350 pages, which is what this book is, and a lot of novels are. I mean, this is not to compliment myself. I mean, I wrote one book. There are people who've written many wonderful novels, but I found it extremely demanding, very difficult. I don't know what else to say.
Is there any significance to be drawn from the fact that your writing has mostly been rooted in the experience of the generation that brought you here, and the film Victoria Day is not? The film Victoria Day is about your generation, about kids. Was there something easier in the idiom of film to express something closer to life as you've lived it?
I don't know if it was that so much, though that's maybe part of it. I mean, Victoria Day, the film, is the film in large part because it seemed to me innately cinematic. There's a lot of music in it, and there's some scenes. There's a big fireworks, firecracker fight scene. There are parts of it that seem so cinematic that I didn't think would translate quite as well onto the page.
Yeah, interesting. Ma'am, there we go.
Has your book been widely read in the Toronto Russian Jewish community, and how has it been received? And then Natasha and Other Stories as well.
Well, it's still fairly early. I think the book came out, officially published maybe 2 weeks ago. How many people in the audience would call themselves Soviet Jews? Okay, so there are a few. So I guess it's filtered into part of that community. Natasha, from what I heard, which, the people who approach me are people who usually say complimentary things. So in that sense, I did get the sense that the book had connected with people and that it, was able to reflect their story or tell a story that really hadn't been, written or told in quite that way before. I mean, there are more and more people, certainly of my generation, writing like this. But it was very, it's very important for me that people who have gone through the experience will recognize this as authentic, as something true. As I say, those people are still alive. They know this, they live these lives. I happen to be fascinated by their stories and their experience and partake of it in some way. But yeah, they're the ultimate arbiters.
I feel to be fair, you should ask how many bodybuilders are in the audience as well.
How many bodybuilders? I know. I have my one boxing friend is here, so.
You talked about the character Paulina as being different from North American women and being much more Russian, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, about what you meant by that.
What I mean by that is she's less romantic. She's less, romantic in the sense of having romantic ideas of what her life would be like. She's more pragmatic. She, is of a generation of women who had a very clear sense of what their lives were supposed to be like. If by 25 you weren't married and you had a child, you were an old maid. And, you had a very pragmatic sense of how your life should be led. Even though I wouldn't, inside all of the same emotions that everybody else has, this desire to be loved, this desire to be appreciated. But I think what's true of Soviet people and Eastern European people is because these are people who endured so much hardship for real, they're just more practical, pragmatic, and their expectations, I think, in a way are lower as for what life has to offer, because life has often been very hard.
Have you read to your partner, Alex's contemplations about marriage?
Say that again,
sorry. Have you read to your wife, Alex's contemplations about marriage, about the nature of marriage?
I mean, she's not here anymore. Maybe she's had enough. I mean, she's read the book.
Yeah, no.
Yes.
Hi. Can you tell... It's really high. I'm just interested in knowing your character development. Did your characters guide you in the book, or did you guide the characters?
I guide the characters. I have a sense of who they are. I guess in the way that it works is I figure out what sorts of things would be natural and authentic to them and what would be untrue to them, and establish what that will be. And that dictates everything. Dialogue they speak, if they would actually say that or if they wouldn't say that. What sorts of people they are. Character, people say character is fate. Kind of figuring out what these people's characters are, what their principles are, what sorts of things they would and would not do if pushed to the edge.
Thank you.
Hi, can you describe a typical writing day? Where do you write? How many hours do you write? That kind of thing.
A typical writing day. I set a goal for myself, particularly with the book, to write 500 words a day, which I didn't always meet. And so I'll write as much as I possibly can when I don't have another job. So for a lot of this, I was able to write just at home in my office and try to write 500 words that I didn't hate. That's really it. And I considered myself a first draft writer, which is, it takes me a long time to generate a first draft, and then that draft is essentially what it's going to be. But that wasn't the case with this book. I mean, that was another sort of revelation to me, and an unpleasant one. The original draft of this book came in at 700 manuscript pages, and back and forth. The final draft was 400 manuscript pages, and if it took me on the order of 6 or 7 years to write it, we can say that every 100 pages is a year of my life. So I cut 3 years, which is hard, I mean, it's not hard to do once you're doing it, but it's hard to face at the end that so much of what you've done ultimately, is just gone.
That's a very flawed logic, I have to say.
Okay.
Don't listen to that. I'm just curious about Birobidzhan, if I may. Birobidzhan has always fascinated me. Birobidzhan is a marshy swampland in far northeastern Russia that was set up as a kind of alternative homeland to Palestine, and Yiddish is still spoken there. Several years ago I went on the web and it seemed to be the case. I don't know how much it's changed. There's a fleeting mention of it at one point. I think it's Lyova who refers to it, or the Seekers of Happiness. Or something.
There was a movie, there's a Soviet propaganda film at the time to get Jews to go there, called Seekers of Happiness.
And when did, or was it apparent, because there was a lot of fundraising and support for the idea of Birobidzhan outside of the Soviet Union, was it, but it seemed to me clearly that at least Stalin was using it as a dumping ground to corral Jews in rather than to offer them, their own happy place. As far as you know, was it always apparent to Soviet Jewry that it was a bit of a camp for them?
I don't think it was always apparent to them. I mean, it served a number of purposes. In part, it's very close on the border with China, and nobody lives there. And it's swampy, and it's full of mosquitoes. It's actually a terrible, terrible country. But I think there were Jews who believed in it. There were, this was a very idealistic revolutionary moment in the 20th century with multiple movements. And so there were Jews who believed in it, who tried to go, and just didn't last very long. It just, though, a city was built and Birobidzhan was built, there are very few Jews there now, as far as I know.
Right, thank you. No, I was just interested in historically. I think, unless there's another burning question, you've been a great audience, and I want to give you the chance to actually buy the book and get it signed. Selling books is how this fellow makes a living, and this is a wonderful one to have on your shelf. So I'm going to say thank you to the Toronto Public Library for the Super Series. Thank you to you. Thank you to the technician, and to you, David.
Thank you.
All right, mate. That was good.